Thank you, Matthew. Thank you again to SFP for this invitation. Sorry you're having to put up with me again. I have no conflicts of interest with this talk. So, what are clinical practice guidelines? They are recommendations which are intended to improve patient care. They're arrived at after careful deliberation of systematic reviews by clever people on the guidelines committee, and as such, they should represent the best evidence available. However, they are informed by evidence, and therefore they're only as good as the evidence that informs them, and they are not absolute. They should be considered as tools to help support clinical decisions, but they do not replace clinical judgment. A traditional clinical model is that the clever, all-knowing doctor tells the patient what's wrong with them, tells them what's going to happen to them, and the patient nods and accepts, and there's no recognition of the patient's own values, feelings, etc. Good guidelines change that. They should inform the clinician, they should inform the patient to reach decisions that are in the best interest of the patient, taking their personal preferences, their values, and their individual circumstances into account in the shared decision-making process. Good guidelines can benefit clinicians, patients, and healthcare systems. Clinicians benefit because they've got access to the best evidence that is available at the time. They can make better decisions. Those decisions and the guidelines that you use work best when the clinician matches them to their own skills. There's no point a clinician, for instance, using a device with which they have no experience and no training simply because a guideline says that is the best device to use. But if you use them correctly, they should provide good and consistent care, and it will also help you defend yourself in a case of medico-legal challenge. For the patient, they can be better informed in helping to reach their clinical decision, and a good patient, especially with the chronic diseases, can use guidelines to challenge poor clinical decision-making. Healthcare systems benefit. They can use the guidelines to commission services that are of proven value, and they can standardize care across different facilities and thereby improve their systems. Insurers and commissioners can also use them as a stick, and they can use them to only reimburse clinicians who work to good guidelines. Examples of how guidelines have changed matters, this ESVS guidance that you've seen many times already today on thermal ablation for truncal veins, and several pre-existing similar guidance has transformed UK veins practice from an operation, high ligation and stripping that was often done by general surgeons, often with no phlebology training, to a specialist-delivered duplex-guided service. This protects patients from general anesthesia, which was the common mode of anesthesia, and from surgical trauma in excess of what we currently see. Patients recover faster if you work to this guideline, and the overall cost to society is reduced. Another example of a guideline changing things is this guidance against treatment of multiple perforators for primary varicose veins. Again, this stops unneeded interventions and reduces unnecessary costs. And the last one, which was discussed in the last session, is this guidance against treating pelvic veins in patients whose presentation is with leg veins and who do not have pelvic symptoms, targeting your treatment to the veins and the pelvic escape points rather than to embolizing pelvic veins. Unfortunately, guidelines take a while to filter through, and as these recent images, which I took off the internet only a couple of weeks ago, show, there are still UK clinics advertising treatment of multiple perforators as being better than the treatment recommended in guidance, and also treatment of pelvic veins for patients presenting with leg varicose veins. However, as I've already alluded to, guidelines aren't perfect. They have limitations, and limitations are usually due to the supporting evidence. There's pretty good data showing that guidelines go out of date fairly quickly. One estimate suggested that after 3 years, guidelines require renewal. Guidelines often will have biases in the evidence they put in. They don't really account for rare conditions. They don't account for patients' wishes or the clinician's competence. And of course, the guidance suggested may not be available to the treating clinician. That time aspect of the evidence is important because examples are the UK NICE guidelines was produced in 2013. This has never been updated. It's over a decade old. And it took 7 years and 11 years respectively for the ESVS and the SVS guidelines to receive their recent updates. As a result of that time gap, if we just focus on ESVS guidance, the recent 2022 guidance had almost half of the guidance were all completely new from the previous guidance. 17% of all the guidelines only had level A evidence guiding them, and even of their strong class 1 recommendations, 44% of those only had level C evidence guiding them. Good guidelines recognize these limitations, which are just inherent because of the data behind them. The ESVS guidelines recognize that their recommendations may not be appropriate in all circumstances, that the decisions need to be made on an individual basis, taking patients' local resources into account, that if you deviate from the guideline, that's fine, as long as you can provide a reasoned argument for it, and it should not in itself be considered negligent. The European guidelines did not look at cost at all. They only looked at the medical evidence, and in so doing, they recognize that in certain health systems, cost will impact on which guidance is appropriate for you. Similarly, the US guidelines, this time under a banner of disclaimer, are very upfront with it. They say that the guidelines only reflect the available body of evidence. They don't represent statements of standard of care, and a departure from the guidelines, again, is perfectly appropriate if it's indicated by the patient's clinical presentation, limitation of resources, advances in knowledge or technology, or indeed with patient preference. They're quite clear that the guidelines do not substitute for clinical judgment or supplant clinical decision-making. So this is an example of a moment when I didn't follow the guideline. This patient, 61-year-old man, fit and well with CEEP2 symptomatic varicose veins, was seen by one of my trainee doctors in clinic, had a scan, looked at the guidance, and scheduled the patient to have thermal ablation of the trunk and phlebectomies. So on the day of treatment, I met the patient in appreciating that he had a 3-centimeter saphenous varix, huge veins, and that for him, the durability of the intervention was appropriate. And we had a discussion, and we agreed, shared decision-making, that he'd be best served by high ligation, stripping of the short trunk under tumescent local anesthesia with phlebectomies, which is what we did. So to conclude, guidelines are useful tools to guide shared decision-making. They are not tablets of stone, and they should be used to aid, together with the patient and the patient's preferences and values, the best decision for that patient. Thank you for your attention.